Hi there, time for another Commodore 64 compilation review, and after looking at a couple of full price compilations in the last two videos, I'm going back to a budget one this time around. It's Quattro Sports. This was released by Codemasters in 1990 with a retail price of just £2.99 for 4 games. So let's take a look at it and see if it's any good. Let's begin then by looking at the packaging in more detail. This is a very standard layout for all these Quattro compilations. They've all got the images from the original releases of the 4 games that are included on the front cover, with the Quattro logo at the front there in the middle. And it always has a big number 4 in the middle as well. People do refer to these as 4 Quattro compilations sometimes, but I call them Quattro because that's what it says on the spine, as you can see, Quattro Sports there. And so the 4 games we've got included on this one are all simulators, which Codemasters were obviously very famous for. So we've got Grand Prix Simulator, Pro Ski Simulator, Pro Snooker Simulator and BMX Simulator. And the other most noteworthy thing on the front of this is that your Commodore gave a score of 98% to this compilation, and we'll be looking at that review later on in this video. So moving on to the spine, as you've already seen, it says Quattro Sports on it, and on the back cover we've got screenshots of the 4 games. So there's Grand Prix Simulator, Pro Ski Simulator, that looks like a zoomed in screenshot to me, Pro Snooker Simulator, looks like a snooker table, and BMX Simulator, partially obscured by the barcode at the bottom there. And in typical Codemasters style, they've levelled some superlatives from the magazines at all of these. So it says Grand Prix was well thought out, the gameplay is fantastic according to Popular Computing Weekly, and also got 20 out of 20 from Amstrad user. Pro Ski Simulator, the simulation is something just as good as it's like being on the slope, says Crash. Obviously that's got the cutout for the spindle on the cassette going through it there, so I can't quite see what's going on there. Pro Snooker, quite frankly superb, give yourself a break and pocket a copy immediately, say computer and video games. And finally BMX Simulator, great fun, especially as a 2-player game, I'd say it'll go platinum, so said Popular Computing Weekly, and Codemasters said it did. Here's the cassette for the compilation then, and it's a single cassette, so you've got 2 games on each side, and strangely they're in a different order to what they are on the packaging. So you've got BMX Simulator and Grand Prix Simulator on one side, and Pro Ski Simulator and Pro Snooker Simulator on the other. Reasonably nicely presented in a nice box there with the name of the compilation above and the Codemasters logo on the cassette as well. So let's move on and look inside the instruction inlay, and we've got overview of each of the games here, which I'm not going to read out, but they've got the usual Codemasters superlatives on them again. Grand Prix Simulator's got amazing playability. Pro Ski Simulator, yet another brilliant Codemasters simulator, the best skiing game yet, supposedly, at least that's what they say. The snooker game, it says, is absolutely brilliant, and the BMX Simulator says amazing realism, and it's got a fantastic action replay. Make it the best BMX game yet. Everything's the best game yet when Codemasters release it, isn't it? So then there's a bunch of adverts for the other Quattro compilations that are available at the time. So you can see there Quattro Power and Quattro Adventure, and maybe I'll be looking at 1 or 2 of those in the future. And then on the inside we've got the instructions, fairly simplistic. You've got the loading instructions, very brief instructions for each game for the most part. BMX Simulator gets a few lines, same for Grand Prix Simulator and Pro Ski Simulator, just the controls basically. And then the snooker one, because it's a little bit more complicated and uses a lot of keys, has got a full page there. And then the other pages are the same instructions in German and Italian for any foreign language owners of the compilation, I suppose. And if you're French or Spanish, then you just have to work it out yourself, I guess. And also on the inlay there at the very end it says the authors of the games are BMX Simulator Richard Darley, Grand Prix Simulator Adrian Shepherd, Pro Ski Simulator Andrew Graham, and Pro Snooker Simulator Arcana Software Design, although it has to be said that a couple of those games were originally developed by a very famous pair of twins for the Codemasters. So that's it for the inlay, and we're going to look at the games now. There were no adverts for this compilation because, well, basically it cost £3, so it was just more of an impulse pocket money purchase than actually needing any kind of marketing. So it's going to be straight into the games, and the first of those is coming up right now. First up on this compilation then we have Grand Prix Simulator, originally released by Codemasters in 1987. This is a top-down racing game featuring a competitive 2-player option with 12 cunningly devised circuits that take you under bridges, through oil patches, power sliding around corners as you try to beat the other drivers on the lap record. Players can use the keyboard or joystick to control their car, and each race is 3 laps. If one of the players finishes last or doesn't complete the race, then they're out of the competition. You'll score points for completing the race and getting the best lap time, and you can also collect the tools that appear periodically on the racetrack for bonus points. Let's start off by talking about the graphics then, and the tracks look quite nice. They've got varied layouts with plenty of detail on them, but the car sprites in this game are embarrassingly bad. Tiny little rectangles with just a dot to indicate what's the front of the car. However, the small size does allow for more manoeuvrability on the circuits. Sound-wise, it's got a nice David Whittaker tune on the title screen, but the in-game sound effects are a little annoying, with a weird engine noise and screeching brakes as you go round the corners. It does have some speech though for the start and the end of each race, and that would have been a cool thing to hear back in 1987. The controls were initially hard to master as the car doesn't move like you'd expect when turning. There's lots of drifting around corner and you have to tap the accelerator to control on the bends. Just moving your controls left and right to turn will see you spinning off the track. Once you've had a few races and got to grips with how to control the car, you can make fair progress though. You'll need a steady racing line, but the opponent car isn't perfect in one player mode, so it does give you a chance to win races even if you're not controlling the car perfectly yourself. There are some annoying aspects to the game though. You can get stuck under bridges if you go under them at an angle and hit the barriers underneath. It's then quite hard to navigate your way out, and that will lose you the race for sure. I sometimes found that you come out from under bridges in a different place to where you went under them as well. The game's obviously inspired by Atari's Super Sprint, but unlike that game, the bonus items you collect don't allow you to do things like improve your acceleration or handling, they just give you extra points. It's also a little bit annoying that if you win the race in one player mode, you have to wait for the computer to finish before you can move on to the next track. The game has 12 tracks to complete, so it should give quite a bit of longevity, and hopefully you'd see more of them in the 2-player mode. In the 1-player mode, the computer gets much better from stage 5 onwards, and it's a tough ask to get much further than that, as if you lose a race in 1-player mode, it's game over, just like in Super Sprint. Because of that, the game can be frustrating in the 1-player mode, but I imagine the 2-player mode is lots of fun as you compete with a friend to win each race. While I was initially annoyed by the strange controls, once I got used to them I had quite a bit of fun with this one, and it's not a bad budget alternative to Super Sprint, especially when you consider it's got more tracks than that game has. Next up is Professional Ski Simulator, originally released in 1989. I'm sure that all professional skiers acknowledge that this is an accurate recreation of the sport. The game features 7 large, smooth scrolling ski slopes, each progressively more difficult and based on the game author's experiences in various parts of Austria. It supports 2 simultaneous players or 1 player versus a computer opponent. Just like in real skiing, the controls can take a little while to get used to. The left and right controls refer to the skier's view, not the camera view, so when you're going downhill, pushing left will make the skier move to the right. The main play area shows your skiers on the slopes, but on the right hand side there's also a radar showing the entire layout of the course. Pressing the fire button repeatedly will make your skier pick up speed, and if you hold the fire button down while on a slope, your skier will crouch and therefore go faster. Yellow bars at the top of the screen tell you how far off the ground your skier is when he jumps. Don't try to speed up or turn while you're in the air as you'll land awkwardly and crash. Each slope must be completed within the time limit, and you'll get a bonus for any remaining time when you complete the course. You'll also need to pass through each pair of flags as you make your way down the slope. Failure to do so will see you disqualified. The presentation in this game is great, with a nice title screen backed with some decent music, the ability to enter player names before you play, a high score table and several in-game displays keeping track of the action. It's also got really nice in-game graphics. They're an isometric style which I'm not usually a fan of, but it suits the game in this case and gives it more visual impact, and there's neat animation on your little skiers. The controls are responsive, but you have to spend a lot of time hammering the fire button to get going at the beginning of the course, but once you're moving, the rotational controls work well for gliding around the corners. I was a bit confused as to why you sometimes fall over going down the hill and other times don't. It's possibly to do with the angle of descent in the isometric perspective, but it can be a little bit annoying. The game's also got very harsh collision detection on the objects that make you fall over, which is especially annoying with the mounds of snow at the base of the flags that you have to pass through. You can also get stuck in areas of the landscape where you can't see yourself and can't get out. It's a similar problem to the bridges in Grand Prix Simulator, and it's notable that the authors of the original version of this game are the same as for that one, the Oliver twins. I also found that sometimes you need to try and ski uphill when you go off course, which is damn near impossible. Another annoying factor is that whenever you crash you nearly always restart facing the wrong direction. This is very similar to BMX Simulator, which we'll come to later in this video. Initially the game was incredibly frustrating, but after a few attempts to get used to its controls and nuances, the first stage is actually fairly easy to finish. After that the subsequent slopes are more challenging and the time limit decreases, making the game near impossible unless you have a perfect run. I only managed to finish stage 2 once with milliseconds to spare, and my run came crashing to a halt on the next slope. The inclusion of a practice mode or the ability to start on later stages once you've reached them would have given the game more appeal, and it could have been a really good game if they'd just given you 3 attempts per slope or more generous time limits, so at least it seems possible to complete later stages with some practice. Unfortunately this ends up being a typical Codemasters game. Great presentation, but the difficulty level is ramped up too soon and it makes the game a chore, and eventually I got bored playing stage 1 over and over again. Let's move on to the next game then, and a much less dangerous sport than the previous one. It's Professional Snooker Simulator, originally released by Codemasters in 1988. The packaging proclaims that this has got to be the best ever snooker simulator. It follows exactly the rules of the world famous tabletop game, all the balls, all the playability. It's absolutely brilliant. Controls by keyboard only, and players use the same keys for directing their shots and adding spin to the ball, but use separate keys to shoot so the computer can tell which player is about to play. The strength of a shot is controlled by the length of time the shoot key is held down. The longer it's depressed, the weaker the shot. If you position the cue so that you're aiming at a ball, then an enlarged version of the object ball will appear behind the large cue ball at the top of the display. This object ball will be partly or totally obscured by the cue ball so that you have a head-on view of the shot you're about to play. Moving the cue will change the perspective on the object ball until it moves out of line or until your aim brings another ball into view. After legally potting a red, the player has to nominate a coloured ball by pressing the numeric key that corresponds to that ball's points value. In addition to the competition game mode, there's also a practice mode where you can do things that wouldn't otherwise be permitted, such as moving or removing any ball from the table. You're allowed to set the table as you wish in practice mode and then start a game from that position by going into game mode. I don't really have a lot to say about this game. It's a snooker simulation, so you know what you're getting. It's got a nice title screen with some music before you start the game, but once you get going, the graphics are very standard for this type of game. The balls are quite small and it's very hard to distinguish the brown from the reds. The overall presentation is very plain and the sound effects are minimal and don't sound anything like snooker balls being hit against each other. The practice mode's a nice addition, but the big problem with the game is it's 2-player only. There's no computer opponent, so it's a little bit boring if you're playing on your own. As I mentioned, it's keyboard control only. There's a good selection of options, but it's hard to remember all the keys to begin with, so you'll be consulting the instructions for a while until you get used to it. Lining up a shot's fair enough, but I found the shooting quite unintuitive. Holding down a key longer for a weaker shot just doesn't seem right to me. I also found that the angle of the cue on the main table view doesn't seem to line up with the view of the balls shown at the top of the screen, and ball movement also seemed unrealistic at times. Balls often stop dead when they hit another one, which does happen in snooker, but not every time. Lining up your shots right and potting balls is hard, and the game becomes frustrating because of that. With practice you'll probably get more accurate and the game would get easier as a result of that, but there's nothing outstanding about it whatsoever, so I'm not sure you'd want to persist with it for too long. Rounding out this compilation is the Codemasters classic, BMX Simulator. This was originally released in 1986 and was one of the company's launch titles. Take part in an overhead view BMX race for 1 or 2 players. 7 different progressively harder courses will test even the best games player. Racers are in a real BMX championship. The berms help you turn, the rough ground slows you down, all the hills and different grade surfaces affect the rider as in real life. Players can control their BMXs with keyboard or joystick, and as well as racing against each other, you must also complete the course within the time limit to progress to the next stage. The game features an action replay function which was innovative for the time. At the end of each race you can view a replay of the action, and you can even press the S key to watch it in slow motion. Now this game was covered extensively in the 4th episode of the Commodore 64 Budget Publisher Showdown last year, so I am going to be repeating myself to some extent here, but I do think this game's a little bit undeserving of its classic status. There's no doubt the presentation's great, the title screen's good, and you've got all the control options, you can choose how many races you want. The David Whittaker tune's good, and the in-game graphics are packed with detail with nice animation on the bikes, although the sound effects leave something to be desired for the most part. Where it falls down a little for me is in the gameplay. It's essentially another variation on Super Sprint, and the first few races are reasonably easy, but after that the time limits get so tight that it's almost impossible to complete a stage if you have even one crash. On top of that, the collision detection is a bit questionable in places. As I mentioned earlier when talking about the ski simulator, after a crash you always end up restarting facing the wrong direction, and you can collide with the same object that you've just crashed into and get stuck in places, and if the computer hits you, you crash and they don't, which is just completely unfair. I've played this game a lot over the years and I've never been able to get past the 5th stage, but even if I could, there's only 2 stages left after that, which means that basically the whole game only offers about 10 minutes of gameplay, so I just feel that the game lacks some longevity, and if they allowed the races to last longer by having more laps in or a more generous time limit, or maybe different difficulty settings so that maybe you don't have a time limit at all and you just have 5 laps, that would have been better. And as for the action replay, while it's fun to watch a couple of times, I just feel like overall it was a waste of code that could have been spent improving the game in terms of adding more courses or something like that. But it's still a decent, well-programmed game, and I do think that the 2-player mode is what gives it more appeal and longevity. For me, BMX Simulator kind of set the tone for the many Codemasters games that would follow. The presentation's really slick, it looks and sounds great, but the game's just a little bit too hard and annoying to have any long lasting appeal. That'll do it for looking at these 4 sports simulators from Codemasters then. I'll now give each game a score out of 10 and then round up the overall compilation rating for Quattro Sports. Firstly, Grand Prix Simulator. It's a decent budget super sprint clone whose controls take some getting used to, but it offers a fair amount of longevity in 2-player mode and is just about the best game on this compilation. I'm giving it a score of 7 out of 10. Pro Ski Simulator is a really nice looking game, but the high difficulty level affects replayability and makes it a frustrating experience overall. I'm giving it a score of 5. Pro Snooker Simulator does the job of being a snooker simulation, but it's very no frills, and the lack of a computer opponent really damages its appeal. I'm giving it a score of 4 out of 10. And finally, BMX Simulator is a well presented twist on the top down single screen racer, but it's let down a little by the lack of courses and the tight time limits on later levels. I don't think it's quite as good as Grand Prix Simulator, but overall I still think it's worth a 7 out of 10 as well. Moving on to the overall compilation rating, and firstly the packaging, well, it's pretty straightforward stuff. It's just the 4 game covers from the original releases thrown together with a reasonable set of instructions and lots of advertising. It's nothing spectacular, but it does the job, so I'm going to give it 7 out of 10. The score for the games averages out at 5.75, and in terms of value for money, well, this compilation costs £3, so effectively you're getting 4 games for 75p each. So for that reason you could probably argue that the value for money is 10 out of 10. Having said that though, you have to take into consideration the quality of the games included. It is a pretty reasonable selection of Codemasters simulator games, 3 of which have their usual polished graphics and presentation. They're all 2-player games too, so excellent for playing with a friend, but only 2 of the 4 games are above average and they're both essentially the same genre. So in terms of value for money, I'm going to give this an 8, and that means the overall compilation rating for Quattro Sports comes out at 65%. Now, as I mentioned earlier, and as you can also see on the cover image here, this compilation got 98% from your Commodore magazine, so let's take a look at that review now. This comes from issue 71 of the magazine from September 1990, and as you can see it's very heavy on the screenshots. There's a lot more screenshots than there is text, so obviously the reviewer didn't have too much to say about these games, but it does give each one a brief write-up. It begins by saying 4 of Cody's best sports simulators are revitalised in this excellent budget compilation, and the most impressive thing is that any of these games would still impress if they were on their own. Not sure I'd necessarily agree with that. He then goes on to say Grand Prix Simulator is a little like Super Sprint and was better than its very own sequel and was one of the highlights of the Codemasters range. Well, I can't argue with that too much since I just gave it a fairly positive review myself. He says Pro Ski Simulator won countless awards, and rightfully so. The controls take a while to get the hang of, but once you do you realise this is fairly like Super Sprint in 3D and on snow. The graphics are pretty neat too. Well, I'd at least agree that the graphics are nice and it is very similar to Super Sprint in terms of the control mechanism. It's mentioned here that Pro Snooker Simulator is possibly the weakest of the bunch and you can only play it with 2 players. I'd agree with that, but it also says that it's better than Steve Davis's snooker and has a very nifty option in the fact that you see your cue and must hit the ball much like in real life. Well, obviously, otherwise you wouldn't be playing snooker. And finally it says the granddaddy and undoubtedly the best game on the pack is BMX Simulator. Programmed by Richard Darling himself, everything is right about it at budget price. The review's summed up by saying it's a brilliant bargain pack and you'll not get better value for money apart from buying a copy of your Commodore for $1.95 and getting 3 or 4 games on every cassette. The overall score, as we've seen, was 98%, which I have to say is incredibly generous. It's not a bad compilation by any means, but giving it an almost perfect score is just crazy. Let's bring this video to a close by seeing where Quattro Sports has ended up in my compilation league table, and as you can see it's sneaked in just ahead of another Codemasters compilation, Quattro Firepower, taking 3rd place and making it the best budget compilation I've reviewed so far. I think that's a fair position for it. What this also means is that the league table now consists of 12 compilations and there's no room for any more on the screen, so next time around Magnum Pack Volume 1 will get knocked off the leaderboard if the compilation I review scores more than 35%, and I can guarantee you it's going to. To find out what that compilation is, you're going to have to tune in next time around, of course. In the meantime though, if you've got any thoughts about Quattro Sports and the games contained within it, then please leave a comment, and if you enjoyed this video then please give it a thumbs up. That's all for this edition of the Commodore 64 Compilation Comparison. Thanks very much for watching and join me again soon for more retro gaming goodness.